Cool. Thank you very much. I'm Mike. He's Cyrus. Pictures to help you out there with it. Cyrus is a developer, and I'm on the product management team. But we're here to talk to you about Apple's new user data protections that they introduced with the most recent release of Mojave. So I called it a rose by any other name because the idea is there's a bunch of different things that people have been calling this, and it's quite confusing. So what are we actually going to be talking about today? Well, we're going to be talking about just a flat-out intro into what these new user data protections mean and when they came in 10.14. How to identify the apps that might be impacted, how to gather the required values so you know how to manage those settings, how to leverage the privacy preference policy control payload, and then understanding how we can troubleshoot and kind of dig in a little bit deeper at the end, and then a Q&A, if you're nice. We might go into that as well. Cool. So, AAA, Amazing Acronyms Abound. No marketing team likes acronyms, so obviously we just start creating more as we start talking about these things just to make it easier on ourselves. This all kind of came around with this, it's been around for a while, but the whole GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, came in Europe, really kind of kickstarted a lot more discussion and ideas around how do we protect end users' data and how do we actually get them to approve when things are actually asking for access to their data. Well, with that, there's this concept called transparency, consent, and control, TCC. Now, this is not an Apple-created term. This is a term that is used around the world to kind of cover this concept. Now, Apple's been using TCC for a while in different areas, but to be clear, they are not calling this TCC. We'll get into that more. What they introduced as their way to actually handle this is the privacy preference policy control. Since we're lazy and that's a whole mouthful, we just started calling it PPPC out of spite and out of ease. We also started joking around and calling it 3PCO because there's 3 Ps, a C. Oh, okay, so it's a dyslexic protocol droid. Cool. And then we actually started kind of looking at it, and we started thinking EU-DDP, end user decision-driven data protection. That's not actually a real thing. I just kind of made that up. Don't use that. It's not an acronym. But that's the idea. We're trying to actually leverage and have the end users approve when things are trying to access their data. So yes, it is not called TCC, but it just so happens to be called TCC everywhere in the framework when you're looking at the actual stuff behind it. So where is it actually impacted? What are these things in the background? Well, there is 2 TCC.dbs. These are SQLite databases that store all of the data for the end user's decisions, whether they are approving or denying access. These are all stored in these databases. There is the TCC framework, which is actually a binary or daemon, whatever you want to call it, that is doing the writing to this database. There is a TCC util binary that is used to reset those settings. So if you had made decisions or other stuff and you wanted to reset and start over again and have all those prompts come back again, you are able to leverage this TCC util to reset those things. When we're looking at logging, when we're trying to dig in deeper, what we're actually looking for is this subsystem with the domain of com.apple.tcc. And then also, if we actually look at the MDM profile guide, it's actually, the type is called com.apple.tcc configuration profile policy. But it is not called TCC. So we're clear on that. Also, FYI, this will all be released in PDF format later, so don't worry too much about snagging shots and everything else. We're going to be looking at code. We're going to be looking at logs. It's not super exciting. Some of it's going to be hard to read, but we will get you all this information later. And I also have some links at the end, shortened with a nice URL to kind of grab everything, so don't worry too much about it. So we got the TCC framework. Well, how did Apple actually implement the management and control of this? Well, they did it through the Privacy Service Dictionary keys. They gave us access to 11 services, being contacts, calendar, reminder, photos, camera, microphone, accessibility, post-event, system policy all files, system policy system sysadmin files, and then Apple events. Now, I have a couple asterisks there just to kind of call out some variances. Both microphone and camera are deny only. There is no preemptive way to whitelist something. So if you have a video conferencing application you use in your organization and you want to push it out to your end users, there is no way to prior whitelist and say this application gets access camera and microphone. This will always be a prompt for the end users. They have to approve the access to those things. That is the way this is built. System policy all files is more kind of a catch-all. It is the most powerful one up there, and it encompasses a ton of other things. It's easy and lazy just to say, yep, you whitelisted the system policy all files. But honestly, it's better to look at the logs, find out specifically what something is trying to access, and grant access just to that service. The whole point why Apple introduced this is to introduce these security protections. If we whitelist it to the most powerful one out there, we're kind of negating some of the value. So we'll dig in and show you kind of how to look a little bit closer at what those are. And then I have a triple asterisk by Apple events because that's the little red herring or odd one out to the side due to the fact that it's not an actual target. It works as a middleman between two applications or two services. When two applications or things need to communicate to each other, you use Apple events to say, I'm going to allow this application to talk to this application. We'll dig through and kind of talk about how these things work. So, as an admin, when you're trying to do this, what do you need to actually whitelist these things, to approve these settings? Well, there's a few things. You need an identifier. You have to identify what it is. If it is an application, you use the bundle ID. If it is an executable, you use the path. Now, I'm using executable and all these things kind of broadly because it could be a binary or it actually could be a signed script. There are different variances there. Future talk, the rest of the presentation, I'll probably just call it application or path to the application, but it kind of encompasses whatever we're talking about, the thing that is trying to communicate with one of those services. We also need its code signature. So unlike text and all that fun stuff, we don't just get the team ID. We actually need the identifier that is built off of the actual developer's signing certificate. So we run a command, and we get back this long string that we actually look at, and that is the unique identifier. That would only change if the developer changed their signing certificate, which should not happen often. Upgrades of an application should not invalidate it. Now, if something was malicious or other things were done and that code signature was changed, that probably tells you a good reason to go back and look at it and see what changed. It's a good thing to use the full code signature when we're looking at it as opposed to the small one because it's less possibility for something to actually malicious be introduced. The whole point is protecting us. And then we need to know what service that is actually trying to access. So I could preemptively gather all my identifiers and code signatures just of all my applications, but I don't know what it's trying to access until I actually open that application and start running it. Opening it might not be easy enough. You might actually need to use the application and trigger some different events in there to actually see some of these prompts coming up. And we have something down at the bottom called entitlements. That's a newer thing that you can kind of use as a preemptive way to look at things. And we'll dig more into that later. It's definitely something newer that's been introduced that we can kind of identify some of those target services ahead of actually deploying these things. So, intro into user data protection. What does it mean to end users? Well, it gives them a choice on what actually has access to their data. It also means they're going to get a lot of prompts. Like a lot. You might have fatigue, and they might be confused, and they might be startled. But it should be telling them clearly what is happening. If the app has been built on the 1014 SDK in Xcode, they are actually required to put a purpose string in there, which means this application needs to access this service because of these reasons. Now, you might see some applications not presenting that. That probably means it's an older application. So, cool. So what does that actually mean then to our admins? Well, it means we're probably going to have to do a lot of education and talking with our end users, informing them that these things are going to happen, and they're not bad things. They should read it. They should be aware of what it is, and they should understand it when they want to click yes or no. It also means it's probably going to be a lot of testing prior. There is no easy button here. You're going to have to understand how to read the logs. They are not easy to read, and they are not formatted nicely. But understanding the values that you're looking for is where it actually starts becoming valuable to understanding what we're actually doing and how these things work. Understanding parent process is another tricky thing. Just because the prompt says that this is trying to access it doesn't necessarily mean that's what's going on. So understanding how things are being triggered or where they're actually going, it changes your prompts. All of these things we're actually going to dig into a little bit more and kind of show you how to look at these things. But these are the things to understand as an admin of what is actually going to be happening. So I have all these bunch of things for admins to do, but how do I actually make my life easier? Well, first I need to identify the apps that are impacted. I have a couple ways to gather this. I can wait for my end users to tell me. That's a method. I could manually launch every application I have in my environment, start clicking through and using them and seeing where the prompts come up. I can actually watch the logs, and I can start looking for things later and watching those things as they go. Or I can actually retroactively go back and read the database to see what my end users were prompted for. Or I even have the means to retroactively look at some logs to kind of dig in a little bit more. And then again, I bring back entitlements. We'll dig into that more in the troubleshooting, but I just want to bring up that is an interesting new future way of kind of digging in and understanding where these requests are actually going to be going. So cool, I start testing as an admin. Maybe I launch something in self-service. What I would actually see, if I'm doing something that is triggering access to one of these protected services, I'm going to see a prompt. If it's in self-service, I'm going to see a prompt saying, Jamf agent wants to access this thing. What you see in this example here is Jamf agent is asking for access to system settings due to the fact that it was actually touching some different things that was in the system settings, the way we used to create accounts, or if you're using DSCL in certain methods, this could have prompted. Thankfully, we've actually changed our method of creating accounts, so creating an account with Jamf would not actually trigger this anymore. But if you're seeing other things, you might see other prompts coming up, and this should tell you. But the prompt isn't always the most accurate. Looking at the logs is where we actually would see better information. Well, what if I'm running it from a policy where it's just a normal check-in? Well, that's ran and triggered by a launch daemon or one of our login hooks. Unfortunately, no prompts happen then. These things either just fail in the background or they move on. So how do you know? How do you know it failed? Well, checking your policy logs, looking at it there, checking these TCC logs later and actually digging in and seeing, was there a request accessed? Am I getting back the information I know, or I'm supposed to, or I'm expecting? It's really, really tricky to kind of dig into these with the different things. So manually calling these applications beforehand is honestly going to be one of your best methods to try to figure out how these things are actually impacted. And the whole idea is to just kind of dig in, and we'll look in to see how you actually look at the logs a little bit closer, because it is not super easy. Other things we have in there where it's super confusing understanding how these things actually work is parent processes. Just because Jamf recon might be triggering a prompt, if you have recon doing collect user home directory sizes. The command we're running in the background there is a built-in command called du. You run du in terminal, you see these prompts yourself. This is just how that du command, since it is touching contacts, since it is touching calendar, you're going to see a prompt for each one of these. But I ran a Jamf recon in terminal, I actually see a prompt that says, terminal is trying to access this. This is going to happen anytime you are triggering a policy or anything that might have any of these interactions. Now, what's your recourse as an admin? Do you just push out a profile that says, well, I'm going to whitelist terminal for all of the access to these things? In my opinion, that's kind of negating some of these security things as well. Do you want that to actually be automatically whitelisted for any other end user, or do you let that actually happen? And if you're an admin sitting at terminal running these commands, I think you could probably click OK if it was something you needed to have it do. Same happens when you're actually SSH'd in. This is another interesting caveat. If you are SSH'd into a computer and you run something that triggers any of these triggers or these events, a prompt actually happens on the end user's environment. So you as an admin, you're not going to see this prompt, but your end user is going to see a prompt. And they're going to see a prompt with a really interesting message talking about the SSHD file, and they're probably going to be a little bit startled about what's happening in the background. Now, again, some admins might look into it, like, do I just whitelist SSH to be able to access these things? Well, SSH in general is kind of an attack vector. So that would be negating a bunch of the value in the security stuff there. Honestly, I'd say just be careful what you're doing via SSH and try to avoid running any of those policies or actions or the things you're trying to do while SSH'd in. Thankfully, Apple recently released a workflow for us to actually turn on ARD again with the kickstart command via one of these profiles. So then you could ARD in, see it on the screen, you run it, you see the prompts if you need it, and then you can click OK. But it's not necessarily obvious right away to the admins where these things are happening or how these prompts are happening. But your end users are going to see them, and they're going to be confused. So it really behooves you to actually start having this conversation with your end user right away and enable them to understand why these things are happening. It's all about protecting them. But if you have applications in your environment and other things you know you want to whitelist, you can do some proactive things ahead of time to kind of look at it. Some of the other trickier things to know how to whitelist or other things going on there with it is actually Apple events. As I was saying, Apple events isn't necessarily a target service. It's not trying to just interact and just ends with Apple events. It is one application is trying to talk to another application. And it might even be two applications from the same vendor if they're signed with two different developer signing certificates. You will see prompts from Microsoft Outlook to talk to Skype Business or talk to a handful of their other applications. I've seen the Updater and other things click out there. There's a bunch of options where this might happen. These relationships happen throughout different applications, and you might not get these prompts till you actually launch those applications and use these different things. Here you see WebEx trying to access Microsoft Outlook, most likely due to a calendar thing. These are things that applications have been doing for a while, and we just didn't really see them in the background. So if you are pushing out WebEx and you do want it to function and access the calendar, you might, as an admin, go ahead of the time and actually whitelist this communication between WebEx and Outlook. Another thing where we'll see Apple events. If you're ever doing scripts that have end-user interactions using things like OSA script, where it's, say, tell system events, or tell system UI server, or tell Finder, and you pop up a message prompt or maybe a text field for somebody to type things into. These are triggering these services. And you have to whitelist this communication beforehand. So this is definitely an impacting for a lot of people who've had those nice, simple user interaction, looks native kind of communication to your end users. So here I see Jamf agent is trying to talk to system events. It's not necessarily clear fully what I'm doing. I actually should be looking into the background. Something that I've seen, though, with most of the different tell finders, the OSA script type things, there's three kind of hidden services in the background that you're going to be communicating with mostly. System events, system UI server, and Finder. That's why we pre-built a configuration profile and uploaded it to GitHub that is whitelisting the Jamf binary, the Jamf agent, and the Jamf app to communicate with each of those three different services from Apple events. We intentionally chose not to just build into the product right away because we were informed, like, hey, only whitelist for the things you know that your product natively interacts with. Well, yes, people push a lot of scripts that interact with these Apple events, but our product natively doesn't. So us overstepping our bounds by automatically whitelisting ourselves for Apple events is kind of negating some of those security things. So the idea was, well, let's make it easy for our admins. Let's create a profile that you can just take and upload to your Jamf Pro server. You can download it as is, upload it to your Jamf server, hit the ground running. But here, if I wanted to look in a little bit more, I actually have to go look into the logs. Thankfully, those logs are really easy to read. I mean, you can see what we're looking for, right? Carl Ashley wrote a great blog digging into this a little bit more and helps you identify. So here I kind of pulled apart that log and broke it line by line. The main things that we're looking for here are three different values. There's the RESP. So this is the responsible. This is the application that's kicking it off. The ACC is what is actually doing the accessing. So here I see my Jamf agent is responsible. And what is the thing trying to ask for access? Well, it actually happens to be Apple script. It's an OSA script. And then if I look down a little bit further, I see the REQ. What is it requesting access to? Well, here it actually, in the top one, it says it's asking for access to Apple events. Well, if I dig down a little bit further, the next chunk of lines is saying, well, it's actually also trying to access system events. So in this profile, to whitelist that communication we saw on the previous screen of the Jamf agent with the Apple script, I would actually be whitelisting Jamf agent to system events. It's not necessarily clear, and it takes a little while to dig through. But again, you're looking for those three main things. Responsible, RESP, access, ACC, and then request, REQ. Those are the values that are the most important in there. They're telling you where it is and what's actually doing those requests and how it's doing it. So, cool, I have all these logs and other stuff, but how do I actually gather this information? How do I start building my profiles? Well, we have to first identify if it's an app or an executable. If it's an app, I use the bundle identifier. If it's an executable, script, or binary, I define it by its path. And then I actually can use a handful of amazing tools out there in the community to actually start building my profiles. Carl actually built this TCC profile.py script that you can populate all of your information in line and build a profile out. Jamf's very own Bryson Tyrell worked with him to actually add a GUI. So if you run that script without any values afterwards, just the script by itself, it will actually give up a GUI to actually do this. There's Profile Creator, created by Eric Brooklyn. A wonderful just profile creation tool. He added the payload to actually be able to do this PPPC stuff as well. Jamf built a tool called the PPC utility, and I say Jamf, and I actually, in all reality, mean him, just him, by himself on his free time. Built this lovely little utility to actually, yeah. I was asking for help around the org, and then all of a sudden he comes up to me, he's like, so I built this. I'm like, that's like 5 versions into what I was looking for, like a product, and it's like, okay, wonderful, let's release it. You can run the command yourself locally, or I actually just uploaded a script earlier today to Jamf's GitHub called Code Signature Gatherer, which you can run via a policy that will actually run through, and you can either specify an application by itself or not specify anything, and it will gather every single application on an installed machine and report it back to the Jamf policy log, its bundle identifier, and its code signature. So, should help out. That way you can just gather all those things. You still need to figure out what it's trying to access, but at least gives you a nice, easy list of here's all the values out there. I'd like to take credit for it, but I actually just pushed that off onto another person that hadn't built the script for me as well. I delegate now. That's why I'm product management. I don't actually have to do the things anymore. So we have some different methods to actually gather that out there. So how's that TCC profile creator works? Well, if you don't run it with any prompts, this is the nifty little GUI that you can actually do to build your profiles. You add in your identifier. You add in your name and your organization information. You say, what is it trying to access? And if you do an Apple events, you specify the other thing it's trying to talk to. Profile Creator has added the new profile there. Again, nice and easy. Add the different values in there that you want. And then we have the PPPC utility that does work in dark mode as well, which, again, Mojave, the new hotness. This allows you to specify either one or many applications and specify what you want to have access to. One of the large benefits that this application has over some of the other ones for Jamf admins, it has this direct API access. So you can actually just click a button and it'll upload it directly to your Jamf Pro server. You have the ability to sign it or have it unsigned, your choice. Everything other than the API option, this would work for any admin using any means outside of Jamf Pro as well. He's got some other great ideas and things that he's going to be coming with this application soon, but as it is right now, this is a great way to do it. Unfortunately, we don't quite have it in the GUI yet. You might have noticed in the Jamf Pro server. Even once it does come into the GUI, you're still going to need to gather these things locally. You're still going to need to do these different things. And a lot of times, I'll still probably end up just building my profile with this application locally. I drag it in there. It has my identifiers. I click upload. I'm done. It's easier than me copying and pasting and doing all that work later. So those are our means to build this stuff. But how do we actually dig into this further? Well, we have some different troubleshooting and kind of digging in methods to actually look at what these things are accessing and how to actually figure those out.
And for troubleshooting, we'll start with, I guess, the list of all of them. The entitlements, watching the logs, periodically running the log command, reading the TCC databases, and looking at the overrides file, which is written from MDM. So here's an example of the entitlements. So applications that are sandboxed or that are taking advantage of the enhanced runtime in 10.14 must upfront declare any of the access that they're doing for all of the different TCC categories. So here's the different entitlements for each of those. As you can see, there's things for Apple events, calendar, and here's an example of Outlook. And in here we can see that Outlook needs access to location, address, book, but then also has Apple events and lists out all of the bundle IDs for the Apple events. One thing to note is that if it's signed by the same developer, you don't actually have to declare that Apple event. It automatically is granted access. Another way is through the log commands. We can either stream the logs at runtime and go through our workflow, Best way to do this is probably looking at the attribute chain. So the second more specific command there is actually going to look for the specific message type of attribute chain. And then we can also do a post look at the logs using the show command. The problem with this is that these are all logged as an info level log, and those are purged usually at reboot. You can, on a machine, either configure with the log command or with a profile, not configuration, but a plist, to actually define those to have a longer persistence. So here's an example of using the command and grepping it, doing the show command with prompts to show all the different previously prompted. Another option is to read the TCC database directly. One thing to keep in note is that you have to have all file access granted to either terminal or whatever the parent process is that's actually running this. A great example of this is Carl Ashley's TCC read. And here's an example of that, showing the different services that have been granted access. And here's another example of the user settings. There's a few in here that we don't worry about, but you can see the ones that specifically have been granted access that we can control. And then those changes are reflected in the privacy, security and privacy in the system settings. Reading the MDM overrides, this file is written from when the MDM profile comes down and defines what overrides there are in the TCC database. Again, to read this file, you also need the all file access. And here's the command to do this, plist buddy, and you can just specify the full path to the overrides.
And coming soon to a Jamf Pro server near you, we're actually adding the full GUI for doing the PPPC profile here underneath the security and privacy. This was briefly shown in the actual demo main keynote this morning, but just to kind of give you a closer glimpse of what it is and how you actually populate it. That's our settings there. And if you're looking to do an Apple events, it has that ability as well. Now you have the ability to bundle as many different applications, whitelisted to as many different services as you want in one profile. Or you can go the method of building individual profiles per thing you're trying to grant access to. This is a never-ending debate in the actual Apple community. Is it one profile to rule them all, or is it many different individual profiles? It really is your choice. The one benefit of breaking these things up into individual profiles is, say I need to update it or I identify a new thing, then I have to go back and edit the profile. There's no easy ways for most profiles to actually do a live change on environments. It actually requires yanking off the previous one and laying a new one down. So for a lot of these things, sometimes it ends up being an individual profile per actual application and service. So it might mean by the end of the day, you might have a lot of profiles in your environment. Thankfully, there's no limit to what you can have on your computers. So we have that all coming, but all of this information, this is a never-ending learning process for us all. I want to thank all the Apple community for help gathering this information. The community has been active as all get out on there. People putting out there. Carl Ashley has done some amazing work out there from the beginning. Matthew Warren, Haircut, is super active on there. You have Rich Trout, write a great blog, as always, being very detailed and helping us understand what's going on. And all this is kind of happening within that Slack channel for TCC. If you're not in there, get in there. That is the end-all, be-all stop for information and resources for intelligent people who have been working on this stuff. There's some great discussions starting on the Jamf Nation community, and then for me, I just keep relying on the Jamf developers to help me be better as well. I have one link at the end here that gives you a link to all of these different great blog posts, the different GitHub pages with these applications, and everything else. That will bring you to our GitHub page with a little README, has all the different information, so you can actually go download and start whitelisting all of this stuff. So we kind of hammered through that all nice and quick because I'm normally known to talk pretty slow. So Q&A. Who would like to ask a question? No questions? Great.
It's an easy one. What happens if my user clicks don't allow, but I need them to click allow?
That's a great question.
Is there a way to go back and like retroactively have that
Yes,
prompt? Okay.
totally. Profiles will actually override, and then you can also reset using the Matthew Warren's or Haircuts TCC reset Python script, which again is linked in this in that link there as well. But there are a couple methods. Your profile will win. Rich.
So this is a question about the Jamf deployed profile that showed up in 10.7.1.
Yep.
As far as I can tell, that only applies to like whitelisting file system space. It does not whitelist any Apple events.
Correct.
I wanted to find out if there were any plans to whitelist common Apple events, like Finder, system events.
Yep. So basically that profile that I uploaded to GitHub that has all of those things whitelisted, are we going to add that to the GUI?
Yes.
It definitely is in conversation. It will not get added to that default one, but we are looking to add a second checkbox to allow you opt into it.
Okay.
Again, not everyone is doing Apple events, so we don't want to overstep our bounds and automatically whitelist for things that people aren't doing. But we do have some built-in mechanisms with our automatically deployed profile that we actually have the benefit of. This will actually get deployed at point of reaching 10.14. We actually have some magic behind the scenes that we know you are 10.14, and if your user approved MDM status, it automatically goes out at login. So if somebody just upgraded from 10.13 to 10.14, it will automatically go out.
Okay.
So yes, we are in discussion and figuring out different ways, but per guidance, we were told not to automatically whitelist for it, but we're finding this is becoming a very, very common thing for people, so we are looking into this.
Yeah, in my own case, I'd written a profile that had whitelisted both for the file system and the common Apple events I was seeing in self-service.
Yep.
So to accommodate for your profile, I took away the one that did file system, and then I deployed a separate one that whitelisted the Apple events for things like Jamf agent, the Jamf binary, and things like that.
Because you want it all as one profile?
It would be nice to have it all as one profile. At the moment, I have it as two profiles
Okay.
because that's how I make self-service not pop up these fun dialogues.
My personal recommendation would be using the built-in automatic deploy one just because you have a higher chance of that getting out immediately at upgrade. And then what I would use is a smart group with the scope of has that automatically deployed profile as the actual there. Because profile list is an MDM command that will come through. So once we have our built-in profile deployed, that will be the scope of all of your other profiles. So they would go out right away, again, before most of these other things are happening.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
The profiles that get built today that we're building manually, when the GUI feature gets added in, are those going to get converted, or will they need to be rebuilt?
They should be. Now, the caveat is if you signed it, there's nothing that, like, it won't be modified. You can remove the signature. But once the back end is there, it should reflect your settings.
And the follow-up to that, regarding the persistence of the settings in the profile, if the profile gets removed for whatever reason, do the settings that you set in that profile persist until they're changed, or do those settings get pulled and people start getting prompts immediately for the things that have been already set in the profile?
Well, I'm not sure what would trigger the removal. So I've done some different testing where, like, say I negated or removed my user approved status on a machine because, like, maybe I was refixing my binary or doing something. My profile actually stayed on the computer. Yeah. So I didn't see that. Now, I would guess, I haven't tested that, the prompts would come back if the actual profile was gone, because that MDMOverride.plist that actually stores all of the information is a plist that's live updated as the profile. It's not a database like the user clicks are with the TCC database, so it's not stored in an actual database. So when the profile is gone, or every change to those profiles, it is right away reflected in that MDMOverride.plist.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'll have to test that more, though.
Hi there. When you're deploying the payloads from the GUI, from the web GUI, do you have to apply all the other settings and all the other tabs? So create file vault and create firewall settings for each time you do one?
That's a great question. No. Maybe you've played with some of our security and privacy profile in the past, and maybe you saw some other things happening. Those things have been resolved. Camera and all those other fun things are gone. Yeah. And we're trying really hard that those things don't happen again. But yes, honestly, when you're building your profiles for this, don't touch any of the other things. If you already have a profile out doing file vault and everything else, let that profile be its file vault thing. As long as when you're building these new settings, don't go over to that the actual file vault tab and check the boxes for file vault. Then you start messing with those settings. Yeah.
Larry, wait, I want to be very clear. So, to be very clear, if you don't go to the other tabs, will it not put that in the payload entirely?
File vault is not enabled by default, so those file vault settings are not enabled by default.
The rest of the security and privacy payload items, will they no longer go to profiles that they should not be in, which is what we were actually clapping for?
Firewall, if it is checked by default, that is still checked by default. You can uncheck it, and if you had another profile that was enabling it.
So things are still going to show up where they shouldn't be. Cool.
If the options are checked by default in there, which there's no more hidden behind the scene, like that you have no control over settings. Those ones that you didn't have control over have been resolved. There are a checkbox there underneath the File Vault tab that has a checkbox for the firewall. You can uncheck that and not have that profile set that.
Wouldn't that cause an issue with like things that are checked and things that are unchecked?
More restrictive wins.
Not always.
Not always. Well, I mean, uncheck it. I'll sit down after with you guys, and I have a test computer, and we can enroll and figure this out.
Yeah.
Right there on one of these new JSSs.
Because I think the request is to pull those settings out into its own option if possible, so that we don't
100%.
accidentally have things set up that we shouldn't.
To be clear, these are the directions that we're going. This new payload, it doesn't actually, by clicking on the security and privacy payload, it doesn't actually even enable this other section. You actually have to go into the privacy tab and then check the box to enable. We're moving to the direction that things are not set by default. This new settings we added are respecting those settings, and these are the directions that we're going forward. We are aware of those caveats, and we are trying to very adamantly move away from any concept of pre-setting things. So everything new that we're adding now, those other things are not being set with any of these new things that we're adding. I said easy questions. Any other questions? No? It's the end of the day. There's a lot of events tonight. There's a great Mac Admins podcast. There's a bottle share at the Jamf office. Pick your choose, go out, mingle, migrate. I'll be here afterwards, answer some questions, and I'd be happy to pull out a computer and test some things out with you.